lot of people used to have these deconstruction experiences and not really have a language for it and just feel very isolated. When a hashtag resonates with people, you see all these people like, oh, you were also traumatized by being forced to watch A Thief in the Night when you were 8 years old? I thought I was the only one.
Between belief and unbelief, faith and doubt, certainty and uncertainty, there is space. Each of us is thrown into this place to love, to ache, to rage, to heal, and to experience the wonder and the mystery of being.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the wonder and the mystery of being. This is episode 25. If you're watching on YouTube instead of listening on the podcast, you might notice things continue to look a little bit different. I am quite decidedly out of the country. I am I am out of America. And I just finished a morning run and I'm a little sweaty. And this is the best way I had to record an introduction. So here it is. Empty the Pews. That is the title of a book that my guest, Chrissy Stroop, edited and compiled and put out a couple of years ago. Now, I discovered Chrissy mostly on Twitter because I noticed her hot takes about evangelicalism and the church in general. And she was very much associated with this term that I've been seeing flying around, evangelical. Both Chrissy and Blake Chastain seem to be connected to that, the origins of that term, I think. I wanted to connect with Chrissy because she has such a wide, interesting range of perspectives, given her background and who she is, what she studied. And she's an extremely prolific writer, and both in short form on Twitter and also in long form in the articles that she writes. And I introduced her more formally in the conversation. One note about this conversation, our internet connection was a little sketchy when we had it. So there's a couple moments where it might seem like we're talking over each other. It was a sort of a lag in communication and a couple little audio glitches in there. But if you can forgive us for that, I hope you can really enjoy the conversation. So without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Chrissy Stroop.
Well, Chrissy, thank you so much for chatting with me. Your name, over the last year for me, your name has come up over and over and over again. And it was just one of those things I'm going to need to talk to this Chrissy Stroop at some point because it just seems like your name's everywhere. I mean, anytime in particular when I heard the term ex-evangelical or ex-evangelical or something like that, very often your name follows pretty quickly for a number of reasons. But, I've seen you created, viral hashtags on Twitter. You're an epic Twitterer. So I've enjoyed following you there. You've edited, you were the co-editor of a book called Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church, which I confess I've just started. So my knowledge of it is limited, but I'm just getting into it. And then I was super intrigued that you have a Ph.D. in modern Russian history and interdisciplinary studies in the humanities.
Yeah.
I have to, for my own interest, I have to start there for a second. Modern Russian history, I've never met anyone with any degree in that or anything in that realm. And you have a Ph.D. in it. So
well,
go ahead.
Well, thank you, John, for having me and for that lovely introduction. I'm really happy to join you. I was just going to say, in PhD research, postgraduate research, you specialize. So my undergraduate degree, I actually have a Bachelor of Arts in History and German double major from Ball State University in Muncie,
Wow.
Indiana. And I was not able to take a lot of Russian as an undergraduate, and technically my undergraduate alma mater didn't have Russian anymore, but I was able to go take it at a local high school for advanced juniors and seniors, like a public school, but a boarding school that you have to apply to get into. And I took a couple of years of Russian there to prepare me to study Russian history, which I thought I wanted to do. I mean, for my first couple of years, I honestly didn't know exactly what I was going to major in. But when I declared, I decided I would probably focus on Russian history. And there's a whole backstory to
what
that.
got you interested in that? Yeah.
Well, the whole kind of backstory of that.
What got that interest going?
It's in the anthology Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church. So my essay in here, let me just pull up the table of contents because, I'll forget the exact way I phrased the title, but I know the title is now defunct, and then, it has a longer subtitle. The subtitle is Confessions of a Former Short-Term Youth Missionary to Russia. So I took these, I took these two, mission trips with OMS International, which is based in Greenwood, Indiana, evangelical organization. I know there were people of different denominational backgrounds on the mission trip, so that wasn't so important as the general kind of evangelical, accept Jesus into your heart as your personal Lord and Savior kind of, check those boxes, and obviously you're also a Republican, and you're good to go. OMS
right.
they look to Hudson Taylor as an inspiration, so they actually used to be called Oriental Missionary Society, and then when I went on mission trips with them, they had rebranded as simply just their initials, OMS. But the way it was explained to me, it wasn't like they actually understood that maybe stereotyping and Orientalism was a problem or anything like that. They said, well, we expanded our mission beyond the Orient, so
right.
So now they're in a bunch of countries.
I've had that the conversation about the term Oriental with a few people that I'm close with. That I'm like, hey, if you're describing a rug, I guess that's okay, but if you're describing people, I wouldn't use that term.
I mean, and I would highly recommend to everyone, Edward Said's classic book, Orientalism, just deconstructing the Western imagination of this sort of undifferentiated, stereotyped East. Said is a brilliant writer. So they were just OMS at that time, and now they've got this slick new rebranding. They are One Mission Society, and if you go on their website, they have a little ticker in like the upper right-hand corner of your browser, and it shows how many souls they have supposedly saved this year, and it just like keeps ticking up.
Oh, there's like a ticker for souls.
There's a ticker,
wow.
Yes, and I'm pretty sure that if souls were actually being saved at the rate that it shows on the ticker, like there would be nothing left for missionaries to do rather soon.
Well, it's good. I mean, like we're going to get everybody really, really soon. And so, I guess that's one way for evangelicalism to not be necessary anymore, right? It's like, well, we got them all.
Pokemon got to catch them all. But I mean, if they, I don't know. I think if they win, that's not a happy ending for me. I mean, especially when you consider them trying to reach the unreached peoples, right? And how that typically is followed by, death from pandemics for diseases that we have immunity to, but that uncontacted peoples do not have immunity to, and also by their lands being despoiled by the oil industry and so forth. I mean, it's a story a lot of people don't know about, like our evangelical great missionary heroes like Nate Sate and Jim Elliot, but they were very aware that they were paving the way for major business interests, the extraction industries, to go in there. When they were working with the Huaroni, which they referred to as the Aka. They knew it was part of the
and
bargain.
I mean, in North America, we have our own history of that, right? Like, I mean, that's the colonial sort of history that are, for those of us in North America, that's our background. Go back a few hundred years, and that's what it looks like.
So the story is how I ended up, getting this Ph.D. in modern Russian history specifically, is that I did these short-term mission trips in Russia. I ended up learning a lot, and it also contributed to the loss of my faith. And, then I was very embarrassed to talk about having done the mission trips in Russia. So even while I was still trying to hold on to some kind of Christian faith, I found missionary activity, particularly of this kind, when it turned out that we were being very shady in the ways that we were like luring people in, like a bait and switch. Oh, it's an English camp. You'll get tutored in English. And guess what? The native English speakers who are tutoring you have no formal training in pedagogy of any kind. And the tutoring materials are just English translations from the Bible with really not everyday vocabulary that you really don't need for the most part. So it was
like, yeah, teaching with an agenda for sure.
Yeah, it was a weird experience in a number of ways. Also, I mean, I went twice, 2 years in a row, 1999, right after I graduated high school, 2000, after my first year of college. And that first year, we had a Russian Orthodox priest who would visit the camp and lead prayer services for the students. And I overheard two of the adult leaders there arguing about this. One, basically taking the position that Orthodoxy is, not really Christianity. And the other saying, like, he's telling these kids they need Jesus. That's a good thing. And the next year, there was no Orthodox presence in the camp. But so also, I thought there would still be a lot of atheists in Russia in 1999, right? I was, 11 years old in the summer of 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I didn't actually know a lot about the Soviet Union when I just got recruited for this trip. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll ask people for tons of money to go to a place I know nothing about.
Right.
But as I said, I learned a lot while we were there. And some of it was very disillusioning. Like, okay, we're going to go convert atheists, right? But wait, everyone at this camp is an Orthodox Christian. So why are we converting Christians to Christianity? And anyway, that's the story of how I got interested in Russia. There's more details in the book, Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church. And that, essay in that book, I mean, mostly when people would ask me, particularly when I was still trying to make a career in academia, and, there have not been many tenure track jobs in this field in recent years, and academia is a mess. And I just eventually just gave up, and now I'm a freelance writer. But I would say, how did I get interested in Russia? I participated in this international program after high school where I volunteered as an English tutor in a summer camp environment. And, I was pretty embarrassed about this stuff. 20 years later, I told the story. It's in the book.
Well, I mean, you and I are both people that, have departed evangelical Christian spaces. And that's part of our story. And, and I know that's like a part of your story that you've talked about publicly a lot. And your background, both personally and sort of intellectually, is part of the reason I'm sure your name comes up so much in this space. But I kind of want to go backwards here for a second. Typically I'll start by like getting into sort of you personally a little bit, and then getting into like your perspective on things. I kind of want to flip that around, because one of the things that I feel like people would be really interested to know your perspective on, and I'm interested to know, is some of the big questions about what we see happening in culture right now. And one of them is I feel like we're seeing a massive wave of people leaving evangelical spaces. For me, that's a relatively recent thing in my life in the last couple of years. But I'm just seeing a huge wave of it now, and I'm sure you are too. Could you, maybe like share your thoughts on like why that's happening? What do you think are some of the big issues that people are really paying attention to, and where you see this trend going, maybe?
Sure. So first of all, I got to put my social studies scholar hat on and say,
yes,
I'm not actually sure that people are leaving evangelicalism in much larger numbers than they used to. But what I am certain of is that we're much more visible. We're much more vocal. We find each other. We're talking to each other, because a lot of people used to have these deconstruction experiences and not really have a language for it, and just feel very isolated. And, when a hashtag resonates with people, like exposed Christian schools or rapture anxiety, you see all these people like, oh, you were also traumatized by being forced to watch A Thief in the Night when you were 8 years old? I thought I was the only one. or, oh, you also got scared when you couldn't find your parents one day, that they were just raptured and you were left behind. Me too. I didn't know anyone else had that experience. So I think it's a really important phenomenon and loose sort of social movement now that's happening, to the point where, people like Russell Moore feel like they have to acknowledge it somehow and comment on it. And the Gospel Coalition types, released this apparently. I haven't read it, but it looks just like a really bad book about, hey, don't deconstruct your faith, just come right back. And here's what's, wrong with deconstruction, or, deconstruct yourself back to re-evangelical or whatever they're calling it.
And I've heard people say, things like along the lines of like there was a certain sort of well-known pastor that did a video on Instagram that bummed me out, because I was like, oh, I thought you were one of the like cool pastors. But he was basically like saying, there's a good kind of deconstruction, and then there's a bad kind of deconstruction, that of Western millennials. And I was like, bro, like you're like 2 years older than me. Like, we're both Western millennials. And you're right. There seems to be a sort of a co-opting of, it's almost like once the term deconstruction got out there, like I didn't have that term when I was going through that process. I didn't know that term. I felt very isolated and alone, exactly as you're describing. It's almost like once that term got out there, people experiencing it had a name for it, and we're like, oh, if there's a name, that means I'm not the only one. There's other people going through this. And then, like you said, we have
the term, we have resources, and so now it's visible enough that we are a threat, and so they have to try to reclaim that language. That's what evangelicals do, right? They appropriate and reframe and rebrand, and but the stuff that I've seen, and again, I haven't done a deep dive into it, where they're trying to do this. I mean, it's no deeper or more compelling than well, if we just wear skinny jeans and make church a rock show, that'll get the kids back. Which I grew up with that, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a Christian band wearing skinny jeans for 15 years, so I was smack in the middle of it. Yeah.
Yeah, form over function, right? Seeker sensitive. You're going to call the bulletin a program because, that's so much cooler. You're going to call the sermon a message. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
that
true.
Makes you hip and relevant.
So that's interesting. That's interesting that you're not sure that there's more people. It's just that there's more visibility. That's an interesting distinction.
So there are definitely things that we can say.
Like that.
Based on the data, is that white evangelicals as a percentage of the population are declining rapidly. But, there's a number of things that factor into that, including immigration. Whether, predominantly white evangelical churches are actually declining in raw numbers. We do have some data reported by the Southern Baptist Convention that they have been losing raw numbers in recent years. It's not a huge dip, but it's something. But there's always a lot of churn in, high control religious groups. People leave, but new converts come in. And so that is partly what has kept, evangelical churches and other sort of high control churches with higher numbers than the mainline churches, mainline Protestant. But I do think that they are losing raw numbers at this point. But from what I've read of the actual sociological data, there's not a lot that we can say about that. So I have to say I can't be 100% sure of that.
Right. It's sort of something that we're sensing in culture, but don't necessarily have a ton of data to say this is what's happening. Well, plus we've just been through a year of COVID, and so I would imagine data is very difficult to make sense of right now, because for spaces where they're not meeting in person, I know so many people who were in a religious space, and then COVID actually, quarantines and lockdowns, actually gave them the space to have time to really think about what they believe and how their faith community is sort of how their faith is, being embodied in their lives as they go out into the world every day. And a lot of people are rethinking those things because of that space that COVID gave them. So I don't know how we would even have data about where things are right now. You know, are you hearing stuff like that at all? Or?
I mean, there's still there's still the public opinion survey data.
Oh, okay.
And we do know that church membership or membership in any religious institution like that, like a synagogue or a mosque or a church, is below 50% of the population for the first time since they started asking that question. So, there is some data out there. It's enough that it does make me think that, predominantly white denominations, conservative evangelical denominations, are probably in decline. But again, I just don't 100% know that. But we do know membership in a religious institution is down. Whether people might still identify as evangelical but no longer, go to those particular churches. And one of the factors in this too, and also a factor that I think gave us a sense of urgency of finding each other, finding a voice, creating collective visibility, was just Donald Trump and the evangelical embrace of Donald Trump. So yeah, I mean, he has made evangelicalism look pretty bad to a lot of people.
Yeah,
which good, because it is really bad.
Right, right. I mean, so that was actually going to be the next thing I was going to ask you about. I tend to not foray into political topics too often, but it just seems like at this moment in time that we're in, this sort of cultural movement that we're experiencing does seem inextricably connected to the politics that we've seen the last 4 years, and then especially the last year. How do you think the political aspect of all this plays into the bigger picture of what we're talking about?
When we look at what sociologists sometimes refer to as the rise of the nones, Nones, the early studies going back to the 1990s done by Berkeley sociologists and political scientists, I can't remember that if they were sociologists or political scientists, but anyway, quant guys, data guys, they were able to causally link the rise of of people with no religious affiliation, people who check none or no religious affiliation on surveys asking about your religious affiliation, to the Christian rights culture wars. It didn't necessarily mean that more people were leaving evangelicalism specifically than before, even though evangelicals are the culture warriors of our society par excellence. But it meant that, maybe people who had some other religious affiliation or just a looser Christian affiliation in their family just decided that if Christians are these people who want to scream at women trying to get health care, or, want to try to stop LGBTQ people from having rights, then I might as well not even identify as a Christian anymore. So that's the trend that started, to where now people with no religious affiliation, which is not the same as atheists and agnostics. Some of those people are atheists and agnostics. Some are spiritual but not religious. They believe various things. But this group is now, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the United States population. It's a huge trend. So undoubtedly, the United States is secularizing rapidly, and evangelicals are losing people. The only question is, do they continue to make it up with conversions and immigration of, say, there's been a lot of, from an evangelical point of view, missionary successes in the global South in recent years, and there's this huge rise of charismatics and Pentecostals and New Apostolic Reformation groups, that to the point where they're impacting politics in very negative and harmful ways in places like Brazil. And so, sometimes people immigrate and then, have their charismatic religion that they either grew up with or converted to at home, and then join a similar church in the United States. So all those factors kind of bolster evangelical numbers to a certain extent, but they're losing people, whether they 100% make up for it or not with converts and immigrants. They are definitely losing people.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, I've spent the last year sort of talking to people as they've been on the fringes of usually Christianity, but religion in general. And it seems like the issues that come up over and over and over again are affirmation of the LGBTQ plus community, racial justice and, social justice, specifically when it comes to sort of racial and ethnic issues. Honestly, like belief in hell, right? Eternal conscious torment. Like there's just so many people that got to a place where just like, I just can't believe in a loving God that would burn someone forever because they didn't, figure out the secret code.
I do consider that an inherently abusive belief. Yeah, hell.
Yes,
and what about in child abuse, right? I mean, it's all coming out.
Yeah. So, I mean, I definitely see that there's a couple of issues like that seem to be at least common issues for people that are sort of questioning their Christian upbringing or something like that. But an additional one that you've touched on is like the last year in particular of seeing the sort of response from particularly the white evangelical community when it comes to the election, when it, not believing election results, when it comes to COVID and the pushback on like just not wanting to take action that seems like actions that seem reasonable to take in a pandemic, and seeing a lot of those things for a lot of people. I've talked to a lot of people that was like those things. Some of those things were like last straws for people.
And,
that's like,
over the last several years, I heard from many people that Trump was the last straw for them to just finally break with that community and leave those churches. And I've talked to both people of color and white people for whom, in predominantly white, conservative churches, for whom Trump was the last straw. But the COVID stuff, I mean, I'm not surprised to hear that some people have said that's the last straw as well. I just, found out that my sister, who's a little bit younger than me, and her husband, they're posting all this ridiculous disinformation and propaganda on Facebook that, masks themselves cause like all these medical conditions. Like it's terrible for people to wear masks and that the vaccine is like this horrible experiment and no one should get it. And apparently they spent at least days trying to talk my parents out of getting vaccinated.
I know. I've had conversations. I try to not be too aggressive publicly, but like privately, I've had conversations with people, and I'm just like, what are people thinking? It's just really it's bizarre to see on a number of those issues. Like, anyway, it's like we can't even agree on facts anymore.
No, and I mean, as a kid who graduated from K through 12 Christian school, that doesn't surprise me.
Right. Well, and it's
they
like
always had alternative facts.
Yeah, alternative facts. That was maybe one of the craziest sound bites of the last 4 years is just the coining of the term alternative facts. If you don't know what we're talking about, anyone who's watching or listening, just Google Kellyanne Conway alternative facts and you'll find a clip. So this touches on one of the things that you've talked about is the sort of, you referred to evangelical sort of spaces as sort of like high control environments. And that seems like relevant to what we were just talking about, because I grew up in evangelical spaces and there was a lot of control on what I was learning, what I was exposed to. And I know that most evangelical parents are approaching that from a sense of like genuinely wanting what's best for their kids. But there's this sense that like out there in the world is this bad stuff that I really don't want my kids exposed to. And it seems like this ideology has caused well-meaning people to create these bubbles where like information has a hard time penetrating. Like, have you, in a lot of the interviews you've done and sort of conversations you've had, is that a theme that pops up a lot?
Which theme specifically that,
well, just sort of like the isolation of these, the isolation of these spaces to where it's difficult to get like real information into them.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. Because they're so resistant to information from the outside their own circle.
this is what homeschooling and the Christian school movements are all about. I mean, okay, hashtag not all homeschooling, but still, it does appear to be a large majority, and it is hard to get, really precise data on this, but it does appear to be a large majority of people who choose to homeschool in the United States are still doing it for these kind of Christian ideological reasons, so that they can indoctrinate their children. And I mean, they of course claim that public schools are indoctrinating the children in secular humanism, but that is bullshit. But I mean, the spiel. They don't believe in neutrality. So if a school is not teaching some specific worldview, it's teaching secular humanism by default.
Right.
Diversity, scary, real scary.
Right. Right. I mean, I've heard Dan Dennett talk about, and I think some of the clips I saw of him are a little bit old, so this may be dated, but I've heard him kind of talk about the idea that simply teaching children about all world religions factually, like, hey, these are the fundamental tenets of this religion. Here's all these other religions, and this is what they believe. That just simply teaching a plurality of thought could allow kids to grow up in an environment where they recognize that the beliefs of their parents or their community are not the only ones out there.
And that's scary. I mean, personally, I think that from just the perspective of social studies pedagogy, religion is a very important phenomenon in global societies, still in world history. And I think children should be learning about that, obviously in a secular way, but in public schools in social studies, because there's a whole lot of history that you can't understand without it. But, every once in a while, things blow up in like Tennessee or wherever, when some school was just responsibly teaching kids about some basics of what is Islam, and the parents just freak out. Evangelical parents, of course.
Oh, of course.
Who's freaking out.
Well, I even remember, like, in my process of my sort of deconstruction process, I remember like buying books on Islam, and because I had always been sort of, I had always come up believing that like Islam was this religion that I should absolutely be terrified about, and that I should, if I meet a Muslim, that I should be scared, And I remember having experiences where I was traveling and I was shooting a video project, and I was in Egypt, and I watched the sunset over the pyramids of Giza from the roof of this Muslim family's home, and we just talked about what they believe, and just human being to human being, like I was having doubts about my Christian faith, and they were sort of wondering about things about their Muslim faith, and we had this beautiful human connection. And I remember just thinking, like, maybe things aren't as black and white as I thought they were,
Yeah.
It
Just
does
being
seem
able to
like
connect with other people and be open to hearing them. I mean, to me, that's a part of embracing and practicing pluralism, which is something that I advocate, despite, being at this point, I think, constitutionally incapable of really holding any metaphysical beliefs. But I'm not anti-religious. And, I like talking about things that give our lives meaning and shape. And I know that religion is not always unhealthy. I just come from a really, really sick and twisted, unhealthy religious tradition.
Right. And I kind of wanted to ask you about, so like, let's talk about that for a second. Like what is specifically your religious upbringing or your background?
Republican Jesus. I mean, in terms of like the specific churches that we attended, kind of all over the place. And so, I can already hear like John Piper stands out there being like, well, it's only because you didn't have sound doctrine that you're an atheist now. But no, it's not.
Yeah, I get that a lot too. So yeah.
So, I was born in northern Indiana. We attended a missionary church. And then we moved from the tiny town where I was born to a north suburb of Indianapolis, and we attended a Baptist church and then a Wesleyan church. And then my dad got a job. He had been a high school marching band director, and then was just doing freelance music stuff for a while. And he still has, one foot in that world, as he now, weirdly enough, is in an LGBTQ affirming ELCA Lutheran church, and he's the music pastor and worship leader there, which I'm very happy about. But so he got a job, his first music pastor job, at an independent Christian church, Restoration Movement, not as like wildly out there as the Church of Christ people. Obviously had musical instruments in the church service. And so we were in that for a while. And then though he didn't like the pushback that, you always get from like the older people in church when you try to do something creative. So he got this phone call from a pastor starting a church plant in Colorado Springs that was like going to be, inspired by Willow Creek, megachurch inspired, seeker sensitive, hip, all that stuff, and would allow him to do a lot more creatively than what he was allowed to do at Traders Point Christian Church in Indianapolis. And technically that church plant was under the auspices of the missionary church, but they never really emphasized that, right? It was basically just non-denominational, hip Republican Jesus. So had that was basically, in different churches, and we ended up moving back to Indiana because Pastor Ron Clarkson in Colorado turned out to be an authoritarian. Hey, big surprise. And, just went on power trips with people and just was abusive of his authority. Gee, wonder where I've heard stories like that before. So we ended up moving back to Indiana. You see how the sausage is made when your parents work in ministry, right? And you see all the backstabbing and all the infighting among people in ministry and all the ways that people just treat people in really shitty ways. Pastors often turn out to just be really nasty to their subordinates and staff members. Anyway,
and I saw that kind of happen both ways. I'm a pastor's kid. My partner's a pastor's kid. And in the case of my family, the church I grew up in went through a pretty nasty church split. And I remember my dad just desperately trying to make everyone happy and sort of not really being able to accomplish that. That was sort of my abiding memory of that period one of my abiding memories of that period of my life. So it's the whole environment can be very charged.
Yeah. So anyway, the youth pastor from that church and my dad sent a strongly worded letter to the missionary church leadership, and then they started their own missionary church plant back in Indiana, where they were both from. That church plant failed, and so now our families are no longer friends. But the youth pastor was the senior pastor, and my dad continued to work as the music pastor. And there was one more church, which as far as I can remember, was just straight up non-denominational church. But even in that one, I remember hearing the pastor, and he had, a doctorate from a Bible college. So we all thought he was super intellectual. Even that pastor in this strictly non-denominational church actually said from the pulpit once that a good Muslim should be a terrorist and a good Muslim should want to kill Christians and Jews, right? This is one of the things that actually contributed to my deconstruction, was hearing stuff like that from the pulpit and being like, I really don't think that's true. And I think that's pretty horrible to say. Yeah. And now, of course, now I know it's not true, but 16-year-old me is 16-year-old
it's amazing
me had never
how
met a Muslim.
Yeah, it's amazing how your gut instinct or your spirit or whatever, whatever term we want to use, your unconscious, your subconscious, starts to identify little things even when you're young. Wait, that doesn't, I don't feel great about that. That doesn't feel right.
Yeah. I knew that the world was full of, that there were a lot of Muslims, right? I probably couldn't have told you a number, but I knew that there were many, many different countries where Muslims lived. And even though I'd never met one, it didn't seem right to me to say, well, if they're doing their religion right, as someone who has not studied that religion, of course, sure, he read the Quran in English. I've done that too. Doesn't make me an expert.
Right.
Just struck me as you're tarring a gigantic group of people with this notion that they should all be terrorists, and that does not seem right to me. And the second time, I distinctly remember hearing that from a pulpit. It was a different pastor. My dad was working at a different church, and I think I was home from grad school and going to church with my parents, and I actually walked out of the sanctuary. And I couldn't actually leave because my parents were my ride, and there's no public transportation on the outskirts of Indianapolis.
Right. Right. It's amazing how much your ride to and from church is sort of like sets in stone the options that you have for what you experience there and how you can respond.
I mean, this was before Uber and Lyft, and I didn't know how to call a cab, and I wouldn't have called a cab. It was too expensive, but anyway.
Yeah. So from there, where did your journey take you?
So in college, I just was questioning. I was depressed a lot. I was still excelling academically, and I studied abroad my third year of college in Germany and England. And by the time I was done with that, which was spring summer of 2002, I knew, and I believe I wrote in my journal, I should look back at it, but I honestly just don't want to look back at my journal.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's I don't know if I want to see that.
I get that.
I knew when I came back that I just could not identify as evangelical anymore. I didn't know what Christianity could look like to me without that, but I was still trying to hold on to some kind of Christian identity and to not rock the boat too much. But, by 2015, I was like, fuck it. The boat must be wrong.
Yeah. I've sort of in seeing how you've spoken about this stuff elsewhere, it does seem like over time you became more comfortable with being like, no, that's actually harmful, and I'm more comfortable saying that than I was a year or two ago. Has there been a progression like that for you?
Oh yeah. I didn't really. Occasionally I would post something on Facebook when I was in grad school about how Christian schools are spreading extremism or harmful views or something like that. And then my mom, the Christian school teacher, would get very, very upset. And then I would sort of take it back and cry.
Yeah.
But I didn't really mean it when I said I took it back. So yeah, there was very much a progression. It was a long, slow, painful process of deconstruction for me. There wasn't a roadmap of any sort. And I also managed to get married and divorced in the middle of grad school. And, there was a lot going on. And I mean, I didn't even understand that I was queer until, I was 33. And yeah, in my mid 30s, I realized that this is too important. The Christian right is really dangerous. I'm going to be authentic. I'm going to tell the truth, and they can deal with it, and we'll see what happens. And so, I published this article in July 2015. That was my first really, harshly critical assessment of evangelical subculture, and my sister was sending me Facebook DMs saying, how could you hurt our mom like this? My aunt was doing the same thing, the kind of triangulation that how can you do this to your mother?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a big issue actually for a lot of people that go through this process who have family and loved ones that are still in the thick of it. This applies to me too, because, my dad's a pastor, my mom, my parents are the rest of my family, actually the rest of both me and my partner, but the rest of both of our families are still very much in sort of evangelical churches. And we've been trying to walk this fine line of speaking honestly about what we think, but also caring for them. And it's very hard. I mean, how did you sort of walk that line? How did you approach it? You've got a couple more years doing it than I do.
I mean, I don't know. I think it's very individual. It's not an easy thing. I had to be ready for a lot of social fallout, but my parents really are devoted to family, and they were able to listen. Eventually, it was much harder with my mom than my dad, and I had already been feeling dad out privately on some things for years. He had become a safe person to just talk to about everything that I thought was wrong with evangelical society and politics. And so he had started to deconstruct some of that stuff as well while still working in evangelical churches. You know, every step of the way with this has been hard with mom, but she mostly respects my boundaries now. She no longer is like, you know, church is a really great way to make friends.
Yeah.
You know, she doesn't do that kind of stuff anymore. But yeah, I mean, I didn't know what would happen when I became this outspoken. I just felt the moral conviction that it was necessary. And I never believed growing up that my parents could love me unconditionally, even though they said they did. I just didn't believe them. Everything else that they taught me and that they sent me off to church and schools to be taught demonstrated that they could not love me unconditionally. So I didn't believe that. I remember then one time, you know, I think I was back from college over the summer or something, and we watched Fiddler on the Roof.
Yeah.
And I just asked them if they would disown me if I married a Jew. And it was a real question to me.
Yeah.
Because don't be unequally yoked and all
Right.
that, right?
Yes, that's a huge deal.
But they were so offended that I would even ask the question. And I'm just like, I mean, I probably got all, you know, meek and tried to just be a peacemaker because that's what I used to do all the time. But inside I was like, how was I supposed to know? It is your fault. You did teach me to think that there are lines that would get me kicked out of this family. You know?
Yeah. And then, I mean, when you came out, was that difficult for them also?
Yeah, especially my mom again, and gosh, and with Trump and stuff. I was in Florida teaching at the University of South Florida. Now, mom told me that, you know, she just abstained from voting for president. She wasn't going to vote for Trump, but and dad, you know, now votes for Democrats. But it was kind of all happening around the same time, and mom would sometimes just like break down into crying and screaming at me on the phone. It was super not fun. But sometimes there also was some humor there, like, you know, when we were talking about the election and I'm, you know, talking about Hillary Clinton, and she's like, well, I can't vote for anybody who's not a Christian. And I said, Mom, Hillary Clinton is a practicing Methodist. And she said, I just don't believe it. What do you do with that? It's alternative facts. Okay. You know? Well, it's and my mom grew up in the United Methodist Church, and then she became just more radical in college through the, you know, National Christian Student Foundation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, it's like you said, right? It's like they're, you know, especially like in that election in 2016, I remember seeing similar things about Hillary Clinton. And I'm like, I don't understand. Like, I'm not saying she's like my favorite candidate ever, but like, I don't understand the vitriol. Like, where's this coming from? And when I would ask someone, they would say stuff that I'm like, I don't even think that, like, they were like, well, the emails. And I remember being like,
they murdered people, Whitewater. Remember that?
Well, I just remember being confused. Like the information you're telling me when I ask and the level of hatred I'm getting, those two things don't make sense together, because I'm just like, you hate her for reasons that must be different than what you're saying, because you're just arbitrarily saying the emails, and we don't even know, neither of us know what we're talking about when we say the emails, you know.
They never see it in themselves, you know.
Right.
They're always the victim, and yet, you know, they're being so hateful and so in people's faces, and, you know, but somehow they're the victim and they're being persecuted. I mean, you know, I remember one time when we all ate at P.F. Chang's, I think, and it was the holiday season, and a host or server said "Happy Holidays" to us on the way out the door, and Mom,
Oh,
you
no.
can just hear the tension in her voice
Yeah.
as she replies, "Merry Christmas." And she was trying to mask the tension, but it was there.
Right. Well, it's like everything becomes a culture war. It's like on every issue, like we have to stand our ground. That's like, this is what we believe, and these are the things that are important. And that ties into, this idea that America is a Christian nation, and what does that mean? And we have to fight for that identity.
Yeah, and you program people to do all of that. You tell them who to hate. You give them fake facts to use to hate those people. And underneath all of that, I mean, there's just they don't have any space left for self-awareness. Evangelicals are the least introspective, least self-aware people I know.
Well,
And I think many of them are really afraid of what they would see if they were serious about introspection.
Yeah.
Although that's also, I think, mostly operating on an unconscious level.
I think that's true. I think there's a lot going on unconsciously, and there's a lot of, like, you probably hear this too, like if something, if some bad news comes out of something, like the Ravi Zacharias thing or the Josh Duggar thing, which I know you've written about, and the response is always like, oh, well, that's not all of us. That's the exception. But in the article you wrote, you sort of make the case that the Josh Duggar thing in particular is a symptom of something that's going on at a deeper level. Maybe you could elaborate on that for a second.
Yeah, well, authoritarian communities, which most of evangelicalism is, I've called it a high control sort of religious group. They open up spaces for hypocrisy for the people who have the most power and privilege in their social hierarchy. And most evangelical churches explicitly teach complementarianism to some level. Right now, the kind of churches that I ended up in, the kind of like hip, cool churches, I don't remember anyone ever emphasizing this. But they sure didn't have any women pastors, Right. And I do remember having a conversation with the pastor who was our senior pastor in high school, who I remember preaching about how quote unquote good Muslims should want to kill Christians and Jews, about gender hierarchy. And he was like, well, it doesn't mean that you're not supposed to, husband and wife aren't supposed to talk about decisions together and consult with one another. But if they disagree, God clearly states that, and it just makes sense. Someone has to make the final decision. So God said it has to be the man. This is probably like the sort of, least extreme maybe version of complementarianism that you can get, but it's bad enough. It's
complementarianism light.
When you have a social hierarchy, you're going to have people on the bottom rungs of that hierarchy abused, and also these kinds of communities they create spaces for exploitation of trust. They create a false sense of closeness between people who share the same beliefs. Sociopaths, predators, narcissists, they know how to exploit that, and they do. And so, when you said most evangelical parents are trying to do the best for their kids, that's probably true, but there are a whole lot of narcissistic parents in evangelical communities, people with serious, serious personality disorders that go undiagnosed and untreated. I mean, they don't even, in many cases, believe in mental health care, right? Only demons. But
yeah, and if you need mental health sort of care of some kind, it's going to be a Christian counselor, and you can
just look at the ways that they twist themselves into knots, protecting boys and men, and often blaming girls if they are assaulted or raped or molested. In some churches, when a pastor sexually assaults, statutorily rapes a young woman, it's played off as a consensual affair, even though there cannot be any consent between an adult and a minor. There's a whole lot of victim blaming that goes into that. And if you just look at the words of Michelle and Jim Bob Duggar particularly things that they said in 2015 when it first came out, that Josh had molested several younger girls, including several of his sisters. He was 14 or 15, and they even tried to play it off as, well, they're all just, around the same age. But he was molesting girls as young as 5, Ugh. Right? I mean, this. First of all, it's non-consensual, but secondly, when you're 14 or 15 molesting a 5-year-old, that is not there's no possibility of consent, and that's not just teenage experimentation, right? That is very not teenage experimentation. So yeah, but they started using that language of, well, we're all sinners. This is why Jesus came, and look who gets to be the beneficiary of that language. And you can see what's really going on in these kinds of institutions and, kind of cultural.
Well, that's
claims,
interesting.
Right?
That's an interesting point, because I have, like this idea of redemption and this idea of like, oh, everyone, like I want to extend grace to everyone. And like that idea seems like, even for myself coming out of Christian spaces, like those ideas are ideas that I sort of hold on to because there are really beautiful aspects to them. And it's easy for me to think that that's like all there is. And if I think about grace and redemption, I'm like, well, those are just things that are obviously good to have always. But you are making a really valid point here that like sometimes those ideas are used to let people off the hook when there should really be some consequences for actions. And
right, and forgiveness can be weaponized and stuff just swept under the rug. You're not supposed to have a continuing sort of open conflict or division in this kind of community. And so ultimately, these social disciplinary mechanisms that come into play serve to uphold the existing hierarchy. And so someone like Josh Duggar, gets off with nothing, no serious consequences, and then gets arrested on really heinous child sex abuse material charges. I mean, involving an 18-month-old.
I know. I'm so much more sensitive to this stuff than I used to be because I've got kids, and like I had a way thicker skin before I was a dad, and now I'm just like I cannot handle that stuff. It's awful, awful, awful stuff. Yeah. Sorry, I sometimes get sidetracked when this stuff comes up because I start thinking about my own kids, and it's.
Yeah, no, it's super disturbing. And I don't have any kids, but I love kids, and so it's really just
well, do you
really,
think,
really disturbing.
I know, like we talk a lot about evangelicalism specifically. I'm curious if at any point in your journey out of the evangelical sort of perspective or worldview, did you make like a stopover at progressive Christianity for a period of time? Was it tempting to sort of like park yourself there? Maybe you could share about that.
I tried to be Episcopalian for a while. At the end of the day, I wasn't really doing it for me.
Interesting.
But I met some good people. I really liked the rector that I had for a while at Menlo Park Presbyterian Church in Menlo Park, California. At St. Bede's Episcopal Church in Menlo Park, California. A woman named Kitty who was just really smart and really fiery, and on Easter would say things like, and if you just want to believe that resurrection is all a metaphor, that's okay too. And right. she was neat. And then after these services, like around Easter, we might go and like plant local species in the native bogs that have been overtaken by invasive species, and do stuff like that. But yeah, I'm not Episcopalian. It's I'm not. Yeah. Well, technically I am on paper. They don't really excommunicate people.
Right.
But.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's been sort of part of my journey too, because I find myself very aligned with a lot of progressive Christians, but I also I can't really identify as a Christian at all for a few reasons, at least at this point in my life. And then and then when it comes to like, I have a lot of friends who have a more secular humanist point of view or atheist point of view, and I tend to find myself more in that camp because I find myself like the idea of holding on to Christianity in some sort of metaphorical way. It felt, at least for me personally, it felt like I was timid to take the next step if I stay there. It's like the next step is like the next logical course of action of like, well, this is what I actually really think. And if I'm being honest with myself, that, the humanist perspective is more the way that I am in the world and the way that I see things. And I think it just took me a little bit. It continues to take me a little bit of time to get used to that. Was there a progression for you like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a long time I considered myself agnostic. I dropped various, sort of traditional Christian dogmas along the way. The first one to go was hell.
Yeah.
But I actually remained afraid of it for a very long time after.
Well, I hear that from so many people.
Just, pounded into me. That fear is almost entirely gone now. It has been almost entirely gone for about 8 years. But it was a lingering fear.
Yeah.
But yeah, at a certain point, I was probably like, by the time I was trying to be Episcopalian, I was probably like, I don't really believe in the virgin birth. I don't think I believe in resurrection.
Yeah. And then I wanted to ask too, like, on your website, you've got this really cool like timeline that talks about your life. And I loved that because I was like, I get to see sort of like the progression of the things that you felt really mattered in your life and that were really formational for you. And then we get to, well, hold on, I'm going to look at it. I got it on my computer over here. And we get to 2014 and it says queer epiphany. If gender and sexuality operate independently, holy wow. And like the thing I loved about the way that you describe it like that is like, I sense the joy in it. And obviously that was like a big part of your journey and becoming, who you are. And I'm sure it tied in.
I was such a heady kid, and young adult, living in my head, just being very cerebral, not very in touch with my body. And I had myself convinced that, this sort of ongoing crisis of faith, and I was torturing myself with it into my 30s, was, somehow an intellectual thing. But underneath the intellectual thing, there was just a lot of things I just never allowed myself to see about myself. And when I started, learning more about gender and sexuality, that opened the way up for me to realize that I never had felt comfortable being a man or trying to be a man. And that I had always identified more with women. And so to realize that I could be transgender, to understand how that worked, was a big deal. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure. And
I had also always been attracted to girls and women. So I thought, I think I had one image in my head for, much of my life from the time that I had any concept of this, which was not probably much of my childhood. What I would have called a transvestite, someone who is very, very femme, always like dressed to the nines and only attracted to men. And I knew I wasn't that, right? And I knew I wasn't a gay man. But I also have realized that, and I can see now some threads of this back through my childhood too. I can be attracted to men. I've just more often been attracted to women. But that kept me thinking that, there's no way that I could be, I didn't even understand much about being transgender until, around that time, 2014. And then I was like, wait a minute, I think this is me.
Wow, that must have been such a crazy epiphany because it would have sort of like put some of the pieces of your whole life in some sort of order where you're like, oh, I see the thread. I see the through line. I can't imagine what that would have felt like.
Yeah, it was. There was some elation that went along with it. And it was at that time that, the remaining fear of hell that had started to fade, but would still come up and be pretty strong sometimes, just disappeared. Because I had to get to the underlying issue, which was that the whole reason I had to work through all this intellectual stuff, and intellectualism had just always been like coping mechanism.
You're fine.
Sorry about the barking dog, by the way. But I became a cerebral kid because I never felt totally at home in my own skin. I never felt totally embodied, and the stuff that we were doing just never completely made sense to me. So I stepped back and became a little observer. And that was just how I dealt with everything, was I lived in my head. And so, figuring out that I needed to understand something about myself to get past that was something that I just couldn't figure out until I was 33.
Wow. That's awesome. Well, I want to ask
in the moment
about...
that it actually clicked.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, do you want the moment that it actually clicked? I was watching like a classic, lesbian movie, coming of age story called "But I'm a Cheerleader," with a very young Natasha Lyonne in it, and I was watching it with someone that I was dating at the time. It was like just a kind of casual thing. I wasn't seeing anyone else, but she was polyamorous and had a primary partner. But we were watching this movie, and I don't even remember what I said to her. But I leaned over and said something and made eye contact, and she just said to me, trigger warning for what can be a slur, but in this context is not. She just said to me, "You are such a dyke," and I was like, she's right. I can be a dyke.
It's amazing how sometimes people in our lives see something in us, right? And then just speak it, and then you go, oh, like I've had that. Not in that same way, but in other areas of my life, I've have had someone observe something about me and then go, and it's something I had never really considered in that way, and sometimes those moments can be really revelatory. Well, let's talk about the book. What was the sort of genesis of this book that that you co-edited with Lauren O'Neill? Is that right? Right.
Yeah, Lauren is a friend that I met at Stanford. I was a grad student, and she was still an undergrad then for a part of the time I was there and working in the library. And anyway, I think it was as far back as 2012 that we started talking about doing a project like this. And then in 2016, when I was living in Florida and she was living in New York, that we just decided to really go for it and put out a call for submissions, also recruited some people, and just started putting it together. And then in a few years there, we got it out.
Yeah. Well, I'm just, like I said, I'm just diving into it, and I'm a little nervous at times because I'm still like in that phase where reading other people's stories like hits me pretty hard. And so like getting into, I sometimes have a little trepidation. So like I'll read a little bit and then I'll put it down and be like, okay, I'm going to absorb that for a few minutes. So, I mean, what were there a couple of specific things in writing it that you really wanted to come across?
I mean, we wanted to, excuse me,
Yeah,
make sure that we had a very, very diverse collection of authors in terms of, race, gender, sexuality. And then we also just had to kind of see what we would get and see what kind of themes might emerge that we could categorize it around. And so, it's got these different subsections. And so you've got, the subsection kind of on abuse and trauma. You got the subsection on queerness and sexuality. And these are just big themes, too, that play into a deconstruction for a lot of people. I mean, the people who are most negatively affected by a de facto white supremacist and often overtly patriarchal religious tradition would be women and queer people and people of color. And so we certainly wanted those voices represented, but I don't think that we anticipated that the vast majority of the stories of the essays that we did publish in this book would end up being by women. But it kind of makes sense that that they are. One of the things that I really like about the book is that most of the essays also are most of the essayists, I should say, and it's expressed in their essays, are rather ambivalent toward religion or God or Christianity. They're not all atheists, let alone all anti-theists, you know. We do have one anti-theist essay in the book, and we didn't want to impose any kind of ideological conformity on the writers, but I like that the book is overall ambivalent toward religion while simply showcasing things that are wrong with conservative Christianity. And it's not just an ex-evangelical book, but it does include some essay contributions from ex-Mormons and ex-Catholics as well. And then one of my favorite sections, I guess, and I'm going to sound biased because it's the one that my essay ended up in, but is the one on diaspora and missions. But that's just because I think this is a really important topic to understand in today's world, is the global reach of American and American-style conservative Christianity. And so one of my favorite essays in the book is the one about, you know, the prosperity gospel in Singapore. That's in there. But I also really like, and that's by Ruby Thiagarajan. But
I might have to
really
skip
like
ahead
J.L.
to that
Powers. I also really like J.L. Powers' essay on also kind of name it and claim it sort of stuff, but in South Africa. It's a kind of discussion of this guy that she met who was telling her about, you know, his charismatic beliefs and interwoven with her own story of deconstruction. And it's a really fascinating essay. Some of them are more intellectual reflections. Some of them are more sort of personal stories. Because I am a trained historian, mine has more kind of historical background and context to situate my story in than maybe a lot of the others do. So yeah, it's a diverse collection in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, one of the things
these themes just keep coming up.
Yeah, I was actually just about to say, like, one of the things that in everything I see from you seems to be like a guiding principle is just harm, and how can we, without saying, like, without looking at all religion and just saying burn it down, like, how can we get to a place where people are permitted to sort of live their lives in whatever way they want to, as long as we're not causing each other harm? Like, that seems to be like a really guiding force in your life. And you know, going through your website, I noticed you have a post that was some thoughts on pluralism, and there's another chart here. You've got a couple of good charts, like it's like a flow chart, and it's sort of talking about embracing pluralism, and so many of these things, you know, genuinely listening with no agenda when others share about their beliefs, treating shared values as more important than shared beliefs. That's huge. Shared values and permitting some. Like, being cool with being around people who have different beliefs as long as you're valuing the same things. That's massive.
I mean, as long as
there's a whole list of stuff.
Extend to each other basic respect and reciprocity. I've got on my website, if you go to cstroop.com/infographics, there are several of these infographics that I've made to just kind of distill certain things that I think about. And I actually post the pluralism one to Twitter a lot. And it's also something that I emphasize a lot of times in talks that I give for atheist groups and in atheist and humanist spaces. And, you know, there's often some pushback on that in those spaces. But I am trying really hard to encourage people to build coalitions across lines of, you know, what you believe, to work with people around values that you share, not to be afraid of diversity in areas of belief and that sort of thing, if people are willing to make sure they're not harming others, then there's no reason to go around telling them not to believe this or that. I mean, it gets a little thorny when people clearly are harming others and clearly are weaponizing their beliefs toward people in other groups, which again is most evangelicals do that.
Right, yeah, but it's that's a good.
But yeah, I mean, I really make a point in my own what I call my practice of pluralism, of making sure that I am talking to and working with people in atheist and religious spaces, where we have something that we can talk about, where we have common goals and values. If I have something to offer, then I want to be there. And I just want to make sure that, I'm not walling myself off from working with a great organization like the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, for example, or Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, which is a pretty liberal progressive seminary. Those are just examples of Christian organizations that I've worked with. I also work frequently with American atheists. I've given a talk for secular humanists of the Low Country. And I don't think you find a lot of people who kind of do both those circuits. For me, it's an important part of my practice of pluralism to make sure that I'm really talking to people across those lines.
Well, I think if
finding common ground.
I think if your goal is to reduce the amount of harm that people experience in all kinds of different communities, then making coalitions of people that share that value makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the reasons that I find myself very often aligned with progressive Christians and also some atheists. It's like a lot of us, especially when it comes to some of the issues that matter to me most, like the LGBTQ plus community, immigration, a lot of the issues that are most important to me. There's a number of people on both sides of that equation that I can agree with and align myself with. And so I'm with you. I think that's a great mission, and I'm glad you're doing it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, what's the future look like for Chrissy Stroop? Where's your life headed? What's on the horizon for you?
I'm very, very slowly trying to work toward a single author book project. So it's going to be a history of kind of the last 40 or 50 years of the Christian right and evangelical culture wars, but from the perspective of survivors. So I am doing interviews for that, so that I can center stories and voices from people who grew up in this and then rejected it, right? So I hope that that's going to come together and be a good project. I'm excited about it, but it's in the very early stages. I'm a regular contributor right now to Religion Dispatches, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So it's a 13-year-old web-based religion magazine that covers religion, politics, and society with a lot of different voices, different perspectives, but generally liberal to progressive. And so it's very different than something like Religion News Service, which very often I think, to be honest, should be called Religious News Service. Because, they carry a lot of water for conservative Christians. They publish some great stuff as well over at RNS, and I've published once at RNS, and I'm glad that I did. But I like Religion Dispatches in that it doesn't carry water for conservative Christians. It is more willing to tell hard truths than RNS is. So yeah, I'm hoping to continue to be able to work full-time as an advocate and freelance writer for as long as I can. It's only thanks to readers who support me via Patreon that I'm able to do that. I'm also starting to get involved with this new Flux community, which is I'm
not familiar with Flux.
It's a new project that is looking to amplify voices that are often not heard in the public sphere and perspectives that are not out there to sort of comment on news and society and politics. And so if you saw my open letter to Russell Moore,
I did.
Yeah, so that was on Flux.
Oh, okay. I didn't put that together. Yeah.
Yeah,
I did see that.
it's a new thing. It's Matthew Sheffield's new project. He used to be someone who worked in right-wing media until he just got fed up with all the people around him not caring about facts, and now he's a pretty liberal guy. And this is his new project.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Well, and as we're talking about all of that, like, my last question was going to be, how can people support you? So, I mean, obviously you've said Patreon is a part of the equation. How else could people support the work that you do and support you as, individually as well?
Sure. Well, thanks for asking, John. Well, I'm easily found on Twitter at C_Stroop. And, if you want to help amplify ex-evangelical voices and perspectives, the occasional retweet or whatever is always nice. Or, if you don't have money to give $5 a month or whatever to pay for my work by Patreon, when I usually around the end of the month, I will do a thread and then put that Patreon link at the end. So supporting via Patreon is great, or just amplifying the request for that support is super helpful. And otherwise, just don't be a dick to people who are different than you.
I can support that one for sure. Well, that's amazing. Chrissy, thank you for spending this time with me. I really appreciate you being so generous with your time. And it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you. And I hope we can continue to interact, and I'll be watching your spicy hot takes on Twitter, particularly.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's been a pleasure to join you.
Okay, that was my conversation with Chrissy Stroop. Thank you guys so much for listening and for watching. I hope to see you again next week. Until then, stay curious.